So when will the government reverse course, start cutting taxes on investment and income to save Canadians from this collapsing economy?
While the Liberals are desperately trying to wave around their sales tax holiday as a win for Canadians, economists and the Conservatives are trying to raise the alarm of a historic collapse in living standards across the country.
Let's take a look.
Madam Speaker, Statistics Canada just released data showing a sharp decline in per capita GDP last quarter. This is the 6th consecutive quarterly decline. This is a made-in-Canada per capita recession caused by government that stubbornly refuses to listen to everyone from the Bank of Canada to private sector economists. So when will the government start listening to the experts, heed common sense, and start cutting taxes on investment, energy, and income to save Canadians from this collapsing economy?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Housing.
GDP per capita is one measure, and the Conservatives continue to raise it. So let's focus on it for a moment, Madam Speaker. Our country's GDP is in fact growing. On that measure, though, specifically, we exceed GDP per capita by leaps and bounds compared to the UK, to France, and Japan, Madam Speaker. That is World Bank data, and that is IMF data. On the issue of tax cuts, which the Conservatives love to talk about, Madam Speaker, yesterday they had an opportunity to cut taxes for Canadians, all Canadians, and they said no. They showed who they are, Madam Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Wellington Halton Hills.
Madam Speaker, last month, National Bank said GDP per capita has fallen by about 4% cumulatively since 2022, which is unprecedented outside a recession. And now the economy is threatened with 25% tariffs that the Chamber of Commerce says could shrink Canada's GDP by another 2.6%. The bigger decline in GDP would come from this government's policies, not for potential tariffs. That's because of its tax hikes on investment and income. So when will the government reverse course, start cutting taxes on investment and income to save Canadians from this collapsing economy?
Madam Speaker, it seems like the member was not in the House yesterday, because actually it's interesting, his question, but the real question that Canadians have in their mind, all those watching, why would the Conservative vote against a tax cut, Madam Speaker? Imagine a tax cut. You know what Canadians are talking about is affordability, affordability, affordability. Yesterday, they had the opportunity to show to Canadians that they are their voice in Ottawa. But what we saw yesterday is that they're the voice of their leader in Ottawa, Madam Speaker, voting against a tax cut at the time where families need support.
The Honourable Member for Wellington Halton Hills.
Madam Speaker, that was a tax cut on consumption, not investment and income.
Yeah, let's bring up that GST sales tax
Holiday, if you
whatever
want to call it
you
that.
want to call it.
You know, the one that small businesses are upset about because they're going to have to spend money to put this in for 2 months, and it's not a simple administration either. They have to go through item by item and figure out, does this match what the law says? Does this match? Does that Ugh.
Well, and that's the problem. You have businesses and even, experts saying, we don't know what this applies to, because some things are in scope and some are not. So,
like, children's books are. Children's sticker books are not. Like,
right?
That's just so ridiculous to me. Like,
but newspapers are.
But magazines are not, unless you get a subscription.
Anyone want to guess why newspapers are in scope of this?
My guess is that they fought pretty hard to get it that way.
Yeah, probably. But this is the thing. So the sales tax holiday is going to amount to diddly squat. Now, the real thing that they're discussing is GDP per capita and GDP. Well, a lot of people don't know what GDP is, and a lot of people don't know what GDP per capita is. And it is not surprising at all, because this is not a term that Canadians typically use in their day-to-day language. So we thought we would start by explaining A, what GDP is, and B, what GDP per capita is. And then we're going to get into what is going on with these numbers and why they're important and why they're alarming. So GDP is just an acronym for gross domestic product. Now, most of you probably know that. But what does that mean? Well, it's a international measurement that essentially says this is the value of the total amount of goods a country produces in a given year. And you can compare it country to country, but it's not really a very good comparison because smaller countries are going to have a much smaller gross domestic product than larger companies. So for example, the United States, with about 400 million people, they have a rather large gross domestic product. Us, with 10 times less population, we have a much smaller gross domestic product. But let's put it in other terms. Imagine gross domestic product is a pizza. So a pizza is something that a pizzeria produces, and just imagine that that pizzeria takes 1 year to produce a whole pizza.
That's a slow pizzeria.
Absolutely. So let's say, Bob's Pizza produces, a pizza with 12 slices, and it's a, 12-inch diameter pizza. And, Jane's Pizza across the road produces a 10-foot diameter pizza with 40 slices. So Jane produces a much bigger pizza in a year than Bob does. Okay, so therefore Jane's Pizzeria has a higher GDP, or GD Pizza in this case, than Bob's Pizzeria. Now, what does this mean when you're talking about GDP per capita? Well, GDP per capita is essentially just taking the total gross domestic product of a country and dividing it by the number of people in that country. So this is where it applies to pizza. It essentially means what slice of that total GDP does each person get? And that's what they're talking about GDP per capita. Why is this important? Well, if the GDP per capita of the amount of people is essentially enough so that each person gets a reasonable slice of that GDP, then that means your living standards are fairly good. Means people have enough, money to buy a house, they have enough money to live, they have enough money to buy food, and have disposable income. Well, what happens if your GDP per capita falls and falls pretty fast? You have a lot more people reaching for that same size of pizza, but you're going to get less of it. And what does that mean? That means your living standards across the country begin to fall. So, what is Michael Chong talking about? What are the economists talking about? What are the bankers talking about? They are raising the alarm bells that Canada's GDP per capita is falling. So, how does that happen? Well, it happens when there's less investment, less business, more people, higher taxes, and higher expenses for everybody in the country. Can anybody think of what has happened in the last 10 years to Canada?
We got a Trudeau Liberal government.
Right. That is spending with reckless abandon, that has imported millions of people and has raised taxes across the board.
Well, and they're trying to raise taxes even more through the capital gains tax increase, but they can't because after this GST holiday went through, the House is seized again. It's gone back to being stalled with the question of privilege. And then there's another question of privilege after that if the first one is finished with. So we're running like a $50 billion deficit this year, and that completely blows away the $40 billion mark that Trudeau had put in place. And they're just spending more with this tax break. I mean, maybe you could argue they're not spending more, but they're not collecting the taxes anymore, and that's the problem.
Yeah, I guess the good news is they're not printing more money, but the issue is they don't have that money to pay for other things that they had allocated that money for.
Well, we're still in a deficit, so where's that money coming from?
Right.
We're going into the red. Either you create more money to cover that, and then it devalues the currency that's currently in circulation, or you have to borrow more. And we're already paying approximately $1 billion every single week in this country to service our debt.
So, we mentioned that people are raising the alarm bells for this. You don't have to take our word for it. Let's take a look at something that our friends over at the Fraser Institute wrote back in August. Historic decline in Canadian living standards officially reaches 5-year mark.
GDP, the final value of all goods and services produced in the economy and the most widely used measure of overall economic activity, grew by 0.5% from April to June of 2024 after adjusting for inflation. But while the economy continues to grow in the aggregate, inflation-adjusted GDP per person, a broad measure of individual living standards that adjusts for population, actually fell by 0.1% during the second quarter of 2024, down to $58,005. In other words, the overall economy is growing, individual living standards are falling. This apparent disconnect is due to Canada's growing population and the fact that the rate of economic growth is not fast enough to account for the amount of population that has increased. Specifically, while the economy grew by 0.5% from April to June of 2024, the total population grew by 0.6%, or 242,673 people. These data confirm that Canadians are still suffering a historic decline in living standards. Indeed, according to a recent study from the middle of 2019 to the end of 2023, GDP per person fell from $59,905 to $58,134, a 3.0% drop over 4.5 years. This was the second longest and third deepest decline in living standards since 1985, and was only exceeded in both respects by a decline that lasted more than 5 years, from June 1989 to September 1994. Unfortunately for Canadians, this recent decline in living standards persisted through the first 3 months of 2024, and now the newest data show the decline has continued into the second quarter of 2024. Therefore, as of June 2024, inflation-adjusted GDP per person stood 3.2% below the level it was in the middle of 2019. Again, despite a few brief quarters of positive per-person economic growth since 2019, the general decline in inflation-adjusted GDP has officially reached the 5-year mark. Due to the continued persistence of weak economic growth combined with remarkable population increases, Canadians have suffered a marked and prolonged decrease in living standards over the last 5 years. This puts Canada just 6 months away from experiencing the longest decline in individual living standards of the last 40 years, a milestone no one should be eager to reach.
So that's from our friends at the Fraser Institute, and that was in August, folks. So we are now in the middle of Q4, and that is continuing. So we're pretty much going to break that record. And is it any wonder? More and more people are coming in. Wages are not keeping up. So there's less and less, pieces of that pizza for everybody to share. And this is the issue. But the Liberals would have you think that everything's great. We're in a vibe session. Whatever the heck that means.
Whatever that means, yeah.
I can tell you what it means, and it's the ultimate form of gaslighting. Basically, what Chrystia Freeland is saying is, we're in a recession that's in everybody's head. You're not spending, and that's the vibe session. You're not feeling the vibe of the growing economy. You're not spending your money. You need to be spending money, Canadians.
Right, and this is one of those things that technically is correct, that the economy is growing, albeit very slowly. Our GDP is growing. but our GDP per capita is shrinking. And that's why we feel as if our living standards have gone down, because they have.
Well, and this is the thing. Now, if the economy was going like gangbusters and the population was increasing at its current rate, we would have much less of a concern, because there's going to be that much more money in the economy for everybody to actually share in, right? But we don't have that. You have far more people coming in, unemployment's going up, GDP per capita going down, more strain on the medical system, more strain on the housing system, more strain on the education system. But this is the thing. You have all of these indicators that empirically show what's going on, but the Liberals just want to cover their ears, cover their eyes, and say, but everything's fine. I'm getting my paycheck. What's wrong with you? And if you don't believe us, if you don't believe the Fraser Institute, maybe you'll believe Trudeau's own government. So this is the latest chart from StatsCan, and it shows GDP per capita and what it would take to actually return to the trend. So what you see is that blue line that keeps going up and down and up and down and up and down. That is the actual, right? So that is the real data that we're seeing. And you can see where COVID was, which is that big dip there. And sure, it bounced back up, but look what's happening now. We are in a steep decline in GDP per capita. And as the Fraser Institute said, we're seeing trends from, the same GDP per capita in 2017. And that's when our population was far less than it is now. So the light blue line, that's just the trend line, right? So when you look at all of the data points previously, that is the general trend in which GDP per capita should be going. So that usually means that over time, the quality of life of people in a specific country should be steadily increasing as long as the economy is increasing. But now look at that red dotted line. So what that means is, in order to get just to the minimum trend, we have to be essentially increasing it at 1.7% per year to get back up to that trend.
Yeah, you can see how much more steep that dotted red line is compared to the light blue line, which was the trend line. So if we want to get back up and back on track, we have to do it at a very, very steep incline.
Well, and look at the difference, between how Stephen Harper handled the housing crash, which was, you can see between 2007, 2009, there was a dip there, and he was able to stop that dip and recover it and continue the trend upwards. Whereas Trudeau, it looked like he was recovering, and then everything just fell apart because, look what happened in 2021, the Century Initiative. So again, as Michael Chong says, this is a made in Canada problem, a Trudeau liberal problem. So are people really thinking that, if we keep voting for the same people, a different result is going to happen? Ladies and gentlemen, let's call it the definition of insanity.
We want to say a very special thank you to Tammy for suggesting this episode to us. GDP per person is a very good indicator of our quality of life, and it's not being talked about nearly enough in the media.